I was wondering if you could also maybe touch on family structure a little bit, family structure, and also maybe a little more on religion, if there's more to add, and how that might have influenced governance in Iceland.
Yes. So what we're dealing with is what we would probably call a clan society. You have an extended family, and it is uh, often called an ego-centered sort of structure, where you have the individual in the middle of these concentric circles of varying levels of blood relation. And one of the things that it looks like in the saga literature is that the allegiance follows the patriarch and class. So, for instance, an interesting little aspect of the saga literature is that we often find these women who are married to a husband that they, in different ways, don't respect. And when we start looking into the family relations, it's typically because he is ranking lower on the class scale than her family. So that's a thing that we see. Aside from that, we of course have in most cases a patrilinear bloodline in the families, and allegiance goes in the direction of the patriarch. Sometimes it can be a matriarch. There are some indications. We don't have much sort of medieval literature that really sort of lays this bare, but there are certain indications that that was also something that happened in Scandinavian society in the pre-Christian era. And a curious example is, for instance, the Danish king Svein Austredason, whose last name is derived from his mother rather than his father, and that's because his mother's family was the part of the family that gave him access to the throne in Denmark. So in some cases, the matrilinear family can also be important for that, and you will, of course, one of the things that we see in the saga literature is that various kinds of feuds typically happen when you have a discrepancy in interests between families that are married in different ways into each other. And this type of social structure, family structure, it seems to actually eventually become the demise of Iceland. Because what we see is that there's more and more intermingling between people, between families, and all of a sudden you have all of these threads of interest that are crossing each other, and then you end up with brothers fighting each other. And that's something that we also see in the mythology. The Ragnarok, the Nordic apocalypse, is going to come when brothers start fighting each other. And that story was written in Iceland, so go figure. And what we see historically is that the 13th century, the early 13th century, is a period of civil war. This is where we have power concentrated in the hands of 5 to 7 different families, and different individuals in that period of time are buying or conquering, basically, the other chieftaincies. They're collecting them in what they call riki, which is the Nordic word for kingdom. And so they're literally just designing kingdoms at that point. And then we have the Norwegian king, who starts becoming interested in Iceland, or has been interested in Iceland for a long time, but now begins to see a possibility of actually annexing Iceland, and starts working with the different families that are accumulating power, and eventually manages to take over Iceland. by having these different chieftains swear allegiance to him and then vote him in as king. So he's rigging the system through the beginning of the 13th century up to its conclusion in 1262, where Iceland formally becomes part of Norway. So there is a progression where we see individuals, of course, moving through a family network, collecting power and monopolizing resources, and in that context also monopolizing force in itself. That's one thing that we should consider too, because there is no enforcement of no formal enforcement of law in Iceland from the beginning. Yeah, so what we see is that you can take a person who has killed a family member of yours, for instance, to court, and the court might rule that person an outlaw because it was an unjust killing. But the enforcement of that ruling relies on you and your family. So you know, an outlaw is given a certain amount of time to leave Iceland or face the risk of being killed by anybody. And that just comes down to raw power. Who has the capacity, the family members, and the numbers basically to enforce that ruling? And then what we see in several cases in the saga literature is that some decide to leave Iceland. But there's also, you know, the famous case of Grettir the Strong, who manages to live in Iceland for 20 years before he meets his fate. Of course, that most of that saga is fiction, but the character himself seems to have been a historical person. So in the sense of when we're seeing this, you know, development towards concentration of power and monopolizing of force in certain families and individuals, I mean, what might be happening here, to some extent at least, in the beginning, before this escalates, is that, well, people are recognizing that they don't have any possibility of enforcing this system. And aside from that, what we also have to realize is that if the Icelandic society is so family-centered, then if you don't have a big family, if you're a transient, then you hardly have any legal rights at all, right? You know, say that you don't have that extended family network, as, for instance, the chieftain, and you decide to move to some other place on the island, and you know, you need to you end up in a legal situation where you need some kind of backup. You don't have any particular resources to, you know, make people interested in your cause, right? Then you don't have any legal protection at all. So that's sort of the failing of the system, I would say. That this is where we see that the system only works for the ones who have the numbers and the resources at hand.